As their favorite fictional character. Or as I said, is he just invisible? I wonder. When that cigar smoke comes wafting through the amphitheater, and we all turn around and say, who's smoking that cigar? And there's nobody there. Wonder who that is. Okay, Chris Redmond was born in Halifax, received his education in Queens, in Kingston, Ontario, and he lives in Kingston with his wife and son. He's the editor of the University of Waterloo Alumni Magazine, and he's an author. One of his books is the Sherlock Holmes Handbook. It's available in the Smith Library and is still in print if you're interested in purchasing the book. He also has a very popular website, the famous www. and then add Sherlockian.net. So if anybody's interested in that, that'll be something to look up. And also everybody knows Bob Coghill. He's a CLSC archivist. He was born in Midland, Ontario, and now lives in Toronto. He has BA degrees in psychology and English and education from York, and a master in language and learning disabilities, and a master of information studies in archival science from the University of Toronto. Currently, he is the middle school guidance counselor at Rockcliffe Schools in Toronto. And of course, we know he's a Canadian because of his speech. And he ends every sentence with it goes up in the air somehow. And anyways, he's a Canadian. He's the one who waves that huge Canadian flag at Old First Night. So, a warm Chautauqua welcome to a couple of Baker Street irregulars, Chris Redmond and Bob Coghill.
Of rain today because I've had the chance to speak on the porch of Alumni Hall, and the thought of coming to the Hall of Philosophy and being at the same podium where so many wonderful speakers have come is really a tingly feeling for me. I was excited about the possibility of rain. So although Bishop Spong says you shouldn't pray for rain, I was. And obviously, as Bishop Spong says, no matter how you pray for rain, it's not going to happen just because you pray for it. It's not raining. But it is delightful for me to be at the Hall of Philosophy. There are a couple of people here who took my course on Sherlock Holmes, and they spent 5 hours with me talking about Sherlock Holmes, and the fact that they're back here says wonders about something. I hope it's that they had such a good time that they wanted to be back. I'm thrilled to see them, and I especially welcome them here. When most of us think of Sherlock Holmes, we think of an image of a deerstalker cap, the fore and aft cap, the magnifying glass, the rather large one, like something like this, the curved calabash pipe, and probably everyone can say the most famous words of Sherlock Holmes. It's elementary, my dear Watson. One of the things that I do in my presentation to children is to go through all of the stories and show them that never once does it say that Sherlock Holmes wore a hat like that. Never once is Holmes identified as having a large magnifying glass. Holmes smoked lots of different kinds of pipes, but that curved calabash was an invention of William Gillette, not of Arthur Conan Doyle. And one thing we know for sure from a very close reading of the stories, Sherlock Holmes never said, "It's elementary, my dear Watson." So all the things that we know for sure are in fact things that aren't true at all. But that's not the purpose of our talk today. We wanted to talk about Sherlock Holmes at Chautauqua. And Christopher and I sat down and did some brainstorming to see as many connections as we could make about the world of Sherlock Holmes and the world of Chautauqua. And we're going to start at the very beginning. We know that Chautauqua was formed by well, he wasn't bishop then, but by John H. Vinson and Lewis Miller, in 1874. Now, the first Sherlock Holmes story was written in 1886 and published in 1887. But as the stories developed, one story is a bit of a flashback, and it turns out that that first case of Sherlock Holmes took place in 1874, the same year as the founding of Chautauqua. So they begin together.
In 1878, 4 years after the beginning of Chautauqua, 4 years after Sherlock Holmes' precocious first case, the CLSC was founded, And in that year, Holmes's companion, Dr. John H. Watson, received his degree in medicine. If you read the fine print in the Daily this morning on the back page, you will notice that Bob and I are giving a brown bag medical lecture. You've just had the medical part of the lecture. So Holmes's companion became a doctor in 1878. Dr. Watson became an army doctor, went off to fight in the Second Afghan War. By 1881, Watson is back in London. He meets Sherlock Holmes. Their career together begins. Back rather closer to home, in 1881, the Hotel Athenaeum was opened.
At the very core of the beginning of Chautauqua were two individuals. There were two men. One of them was a creative and very spiritual man, John H. Vincent, and the other was a very practical, down-to-earth man who was Miller, an inventor and businessman. And at the very core of the Sherlock Holmes stories are two men, one very creative and even considered spiritual in his outlook on life, that's Sherlock Holmes, and one was very practical and down-to-earth, that was Dr. John H. Watson. There are a lot of comparisons between the two men. I like the fact that John H. Vincent and John H. Watson sound pretty close, even though I'm comparing Vincent to Sherlock Holmes and Miller to Watson.
And every bit as important as the two men at the center of the story, in both cases, is the place. Vincent and Miller created their Chautauqua in the woods beside a lake, here centered most of all on St. Paul's Grove, which grows around us here. Sherlock Holmes lives and moves and has his being in London, centered on not St. Paul's Grove, but St. Paul's Cathedral. And London, of course, is beside the great river Thames. London, described 100 years ago as the capital of England and the Empire and the largest city in the world, is most of all a city on a river. It's a trading city. It's one of the few capital cities in the world on an estuary, so that ocean-bound ships come up to the capital on salt water. And many, many of the Sherlock Holmes stories focus on the river that runs through London, including the great story, The Sign of the Four, which culminates on a magnificent boat chase down the Thames. I'd love to see that restaged on Chautauqua Lake.
There are two places, at least in the stories, that are named Miller and Vincent. There's a Miller Hill, which is in the Valley of Fear. It's described as an ill-kempt public park in the very center of town. I hope that's not named after our Miller. And there's a Vincent Square in London. And there's also a John Vincent Harden, who was a well-known tobacco millionaire in the stories. But for Chautauqua, for most of us in Chautauqua, we think of it as a very Victorian place. A place that somehow, even though it keeps up to date, is locked forever in history. There's a poem that I want to read to you, written by a newspaperman named Vincent Sterrett. It's called 221B. Here dwell together still two men of note, who never lived, and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote, that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears, tuned to catch the distant view halloo. England is England yet, for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive, and it is always 1895. Now, with apologies to Vincent and to all the members of the poetry members of the Reading Center, I present Lewis and Miller. Here dwelt together two men of note, who fully lived and whose ideals can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote, that age before the world went all awry. But the message is clear for those with ears, attuned to catch the call, to do the best you can do. Chautauqua is Chautauqua yet, for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A gentle rain drips down the window pane as night descends upon this fabled brick path. A lonely bicycle splashes through the rain, and the bell tower counts out its final laugh. Here, though the world explode, Lewis and Miller's ideals survive, and it is in some ways always 1895.
Very good.
The Chautauqua program is often described as being made up of 4 elements. I think they're identified on the fountain at the center of Vester Plaza as art, music, education, and religion. Those who remember the banners that used to sit on the amphitheater stage on Sunday mornings will remember that they have been restated there as art, education, religion, and recreation. And my wife kindly bought me a lap blanket this week with pictures of Chautauqua buildings and signs, and the key words around the edge stating the 4 elements of the Chautauqua program as music, art, education, religion, and music. There are 3 kinds of people, those who can count and those who can't. But if we stick to art, music, education, and religion, we find that all 4 of those are very well reflected in Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and the stories about their adventures.
In the story of the Greek interpreter, Sherlock Holmes, talking about his ancestors, says, "My ancestors were country squires who appear to have led much the same life as is natural to their class. But nonetheless, my turn that way is in my veins, and it may have come from my grandmother, who was the sister of Vernet, the French artist. Art in the blood is liable to take the strangest forms." And Sherlock Holmes considered what he did an art. Watson said to him, "You have brought detection as near an exact science as it will ever be in this world." My companion flushed up with pleasure at my words and the earnest way in which I uttered them. I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art as any girl could be as to her beauty. Sherlock Holmes said that there's no branch of detective science which is so important and so much neglected as the art of tracing footsteps. Many of the references refer to this reference to his work as an art, and for the man who loves art for its own sake, it is frequently in its least important and lowliest manifestations, and that the keenest pleasure is to be derived. It is the highest importance in the art of detection to be able to recognize out of a number of facts which are incidental and which are vital. In these and many other ways, we can see that the art in the blood of Sherlock Holmes has taken on a wonderful meaning, and we're glad that he had this artistic blood of his grandmother.
Music figures less than directly in the stories, with one exception which we'll mention in a minute or two. But music seems to have been the hobby and the passion of Sherlock Holmes himself. And assigning that sort of hobby unrelated to the work of detection to a detective is one of the many innovations in the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle that then became customary in later detective stories. It's almost impossible to read a detective story written in any later generation in which the detective doesn't have some sort of absurd hobby. Nero Wolfe's Orchids being maybe the best known example. But for Sherlock Holmes, it's music. He's introduced to us as an amateur player of the violin at the stage when Watson is still wondering, will this man be a roommate I can tolerate? And Holmes warns him, I play the violin badly. It later turns out that he plays the violin, quote, thrown carelessly across his knee. If you can play the violin at all when it is thrown carelessly across your knee, I think there's some musical talent. And he attends concerts by perhaps greater musicians than he is. Concerts at St. James's Hall, opera at the Covent Garden Opera House. Members of the motet choir at Chautauqua will be delighted to hear that Holmes even wrote a monograph about the polyphonic motets. Now there is a redundancy for you. The polyphonic motets of Orlando di Lasso. I haven't read it.
Education is one of the pillars, and Holmes, we know, is fairly self-educated, but he did go to university, and there are several scholarly papers. The scholarly papers that were written at Oxford suggest that he went to Oxford. The scholarly papers that were written at Cambridge suggest that he went to Cambridge. So we like to think he went to Oxbridge. Conan Doyle was very much a lover of lifelong education, and in this book, Teller of Tales, The Life of Arthur Conan Doyle, it said that, describing his early days, Conan Doyle had few literary ambitions apart from supplementing his income as a doctor. The process of building his practice absorbed most of his attention, and he constantly sought out opportunities to raise his profile in the South Sea community. So in November of 1883, Conan Doyle became a member of the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society. I thought that was kind of cool.
70s through 1900, a little after. By that time, the last Sherlock Holmes stories were being written. By that time, Chautauqua was well established. But interestingly, both are also very much the product of something that happened in the 1930s. Chautauqua certainly was changed permanently from its roots by the events of the 1930s, by the Depression, which led to the near bankruptcy of the program, the running down of the grounds. Chautauqua was saved at the last minute, as people no doubt know, by a program of individuals and families making donations, buying the leased lots on which their cottages stood, saving the finances, gradually rebuilding the program, and moving off into new directions such as opera. Much of that under the leadership of Arthur Bester, who is as great a figure in the story of Chautauqua really as are Vincent and Miller. And anything that we know or think we know about Sherlock Holmes is not just the result of stories that were written at the end of the 19th century. At least as much, it's the result of movies that were made at the end of the 1930s. The dozen films starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, which can still be seen on rainy Sunday afternoons or at 3 in the morning on non-network channels. 2 of those films, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Hound of the Baskervilles, are really pretty good. They bring Sherlock Holmes into what was then the modern era, but in other respects they're pretty good. And the remaining 10, 11 of those films are rather less so.
Though our image of Holmes was, for many people, was based at the turn of the century. For them, William Gillette was forever Sherlock Holmes. And for people who were Wallace's age, I don't know if Wallace is here today, he would remember William Gillette as the Sherlock Holmes forever. My parents, it was always Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. But for kids growing up nowadays, it's Jeremy Brett, who is being portrayed more frequently than any other actor in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And the Granada TV studios have tried to recreate the stories as closely as possible with the originals as they were written. There were only 60 stories written. There were 4 long stories and 56 short stories. In the Universal Sherlock Holmes, which is a bibliography of all of the things that have been written about Sherlock Holmes, there are, I would guess, about 20,000 different things described or more. So going from the original 60, we've moved to some 20,000 things that have been written on, about, or sometimes even by Sherlock Holmes. When I was flying to the Bahamas once, I was very excited to find in the bookstore a book entitled I, Sherlock Holmes, the autobiography of Sherlock Holmes, which was quite a find. In the same way that Sherlock Holmes is rooted in history, though, in the 1895 year and around that time, Chautauqua is rooted in its foundations of 126 years ago, but right now, the Chautauqua Institution is looking at ways to put Chautauqua more and more on the internet and making things like the CLSC accessible to people all over the world with the click of their mouse. So despite the fact that things remain the same, things are always changing.
There are many curious and one by one minor connections between Chautauqua and Sherlock Holmes. For example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose immortal "I hate war" speech was given in the amphitheater here at Chautauqua, was a keen Sherlock Holmes enthusiast, became a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, the International Society of Incurable Sherlockians. Part of what's now known as the Camp David Retreat in Maryland was established during Roosevelt's presidency during the war, and the section of Camp David where the security officers had their headquarters instantly became known as Baker Street.
And there are lots of connections with various American places. If we think of the Battle of the States on the first night, we get lots of representation from all over the world, even somebody from Canada who raised flags. But there are many stories that take place not too far or have connections not too far from Chautauqua. For example, in the study in Scarlet, there are mentions of Cleveland and Palmyra. His last bow, in the story His Last Bow, Sherlock Holmes talks about the time where he was working as in an Irish secret society in Buffalo. The Valley of Fear takes place in the Vermissa Valley of Shenandoah. Philadelphia is mentioned, Detroit. The most important North American reference is in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where Sherlock Holmes reaches into the mud to retrieve a boot that was lost by Sir Henry Baskerville, and he knows it's his because of the label on the boot which says, Myers, Toronto. The Red-Headed League, the fictional league, was supposed to have been started in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. There are also mentions in the Sherlock Holmes stories of New York and of Niagara Falls. There's a quote that says, from a drop of water, a logician could deduce the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of either. There are also mentions of California and Florida. I know a lot of Chicagoans spend a lot of time in Florida.
We thought we'd take the opportunity to recommend a Sherlock Holmes story, recommend stories for a number of Chautauqua organizations and groups, since nearly all interests are represented at Chautauqua, and nearly all interests with a little imagination are represented in the Sherlock Holmes stories. For the Opera Guild in particular, we would recommend the tale A Scandal in Bohemia, whose principal figure, whether she is the villain, the heroine, or the third party, depends on your reading of the story. But clearly the most interesting character in the story, besides Holmes himself, is Irene Adler, operatic contralto, born in New Jersey, has sung at La Scala, principal at the Imperial Opera of Warsaw, former associate of the King of Bohemia, and so on. It would also be reasonable to recommend a study of A Scandal in Bohemia as the best story for members of the Hebrew congregation of Chautauqua because of a brief reference to a Hebrew rabbi, as if there were any other.
If you're interested in the Bird Tree and Garden Club, one of the books that Holmes carried when he was in disguise in the story of the Empty House was called The Origin of Tree Worship. And if you've been a member of the Bird Tree and Garden Club, they come pretty close to tree worship sometimes. There are stories named after trees like the copper beeches, and in his retirement, Sherlock Holmes kept these in Sussex.
For the CLSC itself, and perhaps also for the College Club, we recommend The Adventure of the Three Students, a story in which there is no murder, no jewel theft, nothing really except three students preparing for a Greek exam, one of whom has cheated.
The Chautauqua Conservatory Theater Company would be well represented in the stories. There are several theaters mentioned, not the Bratton Theater, but there is the Lyceum Theater, the Imperial Theater, the Haymarket Theater, and one of the police inspectors from Scotland Yard said to Sherlock Holmes, of Sherlock Holmes, he would have made an actor, and a rare one. And a description of this this ability is taken from the story Scandal in Bohemia. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned in a few minutes in the character of an amiable and simple-minded nonconformist clergyman. His broad black hat, his baggy trousers, his white tie, his sympathetic smile, and general look of peering and benevolent curiosity were such as Mr. John Hare alone could have equaled. It was not merely that Holmes changed his costume, his expression, his manner. His very soul seemed to vary with every fresh part he assumed. The stage lost a fine actor, even as science lost an acute reasoner when he became a specialist in crime.
For the friends of the library, we'd recommend the story of The Illustrious Client, in which Watson has to scurry off to the London Library to do some background research. For the Women's Club, the story The Crooked Man, in which a key figure is a member of the Guild of St. George, not the Guild of the Seven Seals. For Catholic House, how about The Adventure of Black Peter, which mentions that Holmes had investigated the murder of Cardinal Tosca.
Now, this is a bit of a stretch, but there is a story called The Speckled Band, which is as close as I can get to the community game.
For the Boys and Girls Club at the Children's School, how about the Naval Treaty, in which Holmes refers to the board schools, the new public schools that were being established in England in the last decade of the 19th century.
The School of Art could be represented in the story of the retired colorman. At one point, talking to Watson, he says, cut out the poetry, Watson, which would not endear him to the Writers' Center. And I know one of my friends, Irene Taber, spends a great deal of time throwing clay pots and making beautiful ceramics. And ceramic busts of Napoleon play a feature in the Six Napoleons.
Which is also the appropriate story for the Chautauqua Daily. As Holmes says, the press is a remarkable invention.
The King's Sons and Daughters is a house here at Chautauqua, and in the Illustrious Client, one of the clients was Edward, who was the King's son.
And other Sherlock Holmes stories have mentions of bicycles. In fact, one of the stories is The Solitary Cyclist. Bicycles, visits to the post office, something that was a daily routine in Victorian England and is a daily routine at Chautauqua, but not now too many other places. Sailboats, especially on the Thames. And in the very first Sherlock Holmes story, as Holmes meets Watson, what are they both complaining about? The difficulty of finding rental accommodation.
Holmes says to Watson, my life is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplace of existence. And I think all of us here know that Chautauqua is certainly an escape from the commonplace of existence.
We thought we'd finish with a word or two about Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, who was born in Edinburgh, trained as a physician, family doctor for a few years in Southsea in the south of England, but found that patients weren't coming often enough to provide the level of income he would have liked, and that he wasn't making the most of his creativity. He wanted to write stories and tell stories. And he began first with some very sensational stories, which he sent out to popular magazines, which sent them back. He sent them out again. I think they came back again. One of them, he said, I think he said went out 37 times before it finally stayed away. But gradually his stories began to be published. And the real success came with the creation of Sherlock Holmes, first in a novel, then in a second novel, then in a series of short stories, and then in many more stories as the fame increased and the money increased. The work he was really interested in was not anything as frivolous as detective stories. He wanted to write historical novels, and indeed he did write several historical novels, one or two of which are still in print, although not many people have in fact read them. He he was involved in many kinds of public service, took a role in public health matters as a doctor, was very involved in organized sport. He was at the finish line of the marathon in the London Olympics. During the Boer War at the end of the 19th century, he organized a field hospital and went out to South Africa as a military doctor. Doyle can be given credit for introducing recreational skiing to Switzerland.
For his history of the Boer War, Arthur Conan Doyle was knighted and became Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That was in 1902. From about 1900 to 1930, the last 30 years of his life, he spent a great deal of time, effort, and money devoted to the cause of spiritualism. He was a great believer in the cause, and he wrote a great deal of information about it. And he did visit America. He visited Buffalo. And Christopher has written a book called Welcome to America, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, but he says he's found no evidence that Conan Doyle visited Lilydale. Although I would like to think that because of his interest in spiritualism and because of his closeness to the place, that he would have to have visited Lilydale. And on the Lilydale website, it does indeed say that Arthur Conan Doyle visited there. But last year I went over to Lilydale to speak with the historian and look through their archives, and unfortunately, I could find absolutely no evidence that Arthur Conan Doyle was there, but I think the rules of evidence may be slightly different at Lilydale.
Doyle was 71 at his death on July the 7th, 1930, so that he lived well into the 20th century and into the modern era. I thought I would just look up what was happening at Chautauqua on July the 7th, 1930. The speaker in the Hall of Philosophy that afternoon was Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the modern home. And that evening in Norton Hall, there was the first performance ever by the new Chautauqua Repertory Theater, the beginnings of professional theater at Chautauqua. The Chautauqua Repertory Theater, coming in from Cleveland for the summer, presented The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde has a considerable connection with Arthur Conan Doyle because in 1889, a young publisher took him and Oscar Wilde and another fellow out to lunch together at the Langham Hotel, and after plying them with the things you ply authors with, said, I want each of you to write a novel which we will serialize in Lippincott's magazine. The third man wrote something dull about politics. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote The Sign of the Four, the second of the Sherlock Holmes novels, and Oscar Wilde lived up to his contract by writing The Picture of Dorian Gray. So The Importance of Being Earnest appeared at Chautauqua on the day when Doyle died at his home in southern England. Incidentally, the 1930 graduating class of the CLSC was the Thomas A. Edison class. And it is even possible to find a reference to Edison in the Sherlock Holmes stories. At the end of The Hound of the Baskervilles, the young man who has inherited gloomy old Baskerville Hall says, come back and see me in a year. I'll get some Swan and Edison bulbs in here and you won't recognize the place. There's a lot about Chautauqua that might not be recognized by the people who founded it either, but the essentials of the place are still the same. And I think the essentials of Baskerville Hall might still be the same even after the power went in. I think that's as much time for general presentation as we have.
Before you leave, this is the book that he wrote. I have no idea where it's being sold, but it is available. And maybe they'll come back again sometime. Thank you.